Karl Marx. He's easily one of the most influential and definitely one of the most controversial thinkers in all of history. So today we're going to unpack his ideas, tracing them from their philosophical roots all the way to their revolutionary conclusions.
So let's just start with the one question that's really at the heart of everything Marx wrote. What is it that actually pushes history forward? Is it the power of great ideas, a grand debate between philosophies? Or is it something a lot more gritty, a down-to-earth struggle over who owns the stuff? I want you to hold on to that question as we go.
And here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at where Marx got his ideas. Then, we'll dig into what he saw as the engine of history. After that, we'll peel back the layers on capitalism's hidden logic, and we'll wrap up with his vision for a communist future.
Okay, so where did these world-changing ideas even come from? Well, Marx didn't just invent them out of thin air. His work is this really powerful mix, a synthesis of the biggest intellectual trends happening in Europe at the time. He really stood on the shoulders of three giants. From German philosophy, he borrowed his whole method for understanding how history changes. From British political economy, he grabbed theories about labor and value. And from the French revolutionary tradition, he took his ideas about class struggle and revolution. But here's the really genius part. He took a lot of these ideas, which were often used to defend the system, and he completely flipped them on their head to critique it. So let's start with that philosophical method, because it is the engine for everything else. It's a concept called the dialectic, and for Marx, it was the key to understanding all of human history. In the simplest terms, the dialectic is just the idea that progress happens through conflict. It's not a nice straight line. Instead, it's a constant clash where two opposing forces slam into each other and create something totally new in the process. So how does this actually work? Well, it's kind of like a three-step dance. You start with a thesis. That's the way things are right now. But that thesis, just by existing, creates its own opposite, the antithesis. The conflict between these two is finally resolved in a new idea, a synthesis, which borrows a little something from both. Think about a seed, right? The seed is the thesis. It gets destroyed or negated by the plant that grows from it. That's the antithesis. The result? Fruit, which contains new seeds. That's the synthesis. And you can see this play out in history. You start with the thesis of absolute rule, a despotism. Its opposite, its antithesis, is total chaotic freedom, unlicensed democracy. The clash between these two extremes leads to a new synthesis, a constitutional monarchy, which tries to balance both authority and liberty. For Marx, this cycle, over and over, is what pushes society forward. And this is the absolute game changer. Marx took this idea and turned it completely upside down. The philosopher who developed it, Hegel, thought this was a battle of ideas. He believed ideas shape our physical world. Marx said, nope, you've got it backwards. He argued that our material conditions, like our economy, are what shape our ideas. He basically took Hegel's fancy philosophical engine and put it on a whole new set of economic tracks. And this leads us right to his famous concept of the base and superstructure. For Marx, the base, the very foundation of any society, is its economy, how we produce things and who owns that production. And everything else, the entire superstructure, our laws, our government, our religion, our culture, is built on top of and shaped by that economic base. So if you want to understand a society, Marx says, don't look at its art or its politics first. Look at its economy. Okay, so now that we have this framework, this materialist lens, let's use it to look at the economic system that Marx was obsessed with, and the one we still live in, capitalism. What did he see when he looked under the hood? Well, he saw this. This is maybe the most famous line he ever wrote. It's how the Communist Manifesto kicks off, and it's the absolute core of his analysis. For Marx, that dialectical conflict we talked about, the engine of history, is the constant struggle between different economic classes. And in a capitalist society, he argued, this struggle gets boiled down to two major opposing teams. On one side, you have the bourgeoisie. These are the owners. They own what he called the means of production, the factories, the land, the machinery, all the capital. On the other side, you have the proletariat, the workers. They don't own any of that stuff. The only thing they truly own is their own ability to work, which they have to sell for a wage just to survive. And to bring this into our world, it's pretty easy to draw a parallel. You can think of the bourgeoisie as being like the C-suite executives and the major shareholders of a corporation. They control the company's assets and call the shots. The proletariat, well, that's everyone else, the salaried and hourly employees who actually do the work.
And according to Marx, their fundamental economic interests are just not aligned. So if these two groups are in a constant struggle, what are they fighting over? It all comes down to a really simple question. Where does profit actually come from? And Marx had a very specific answer, a little something he called surplus value. Okay, so let's walk through how this works, step by step. Imagine a worker in a factory. Over the course of their day, through their labor, they produce a product. And let's just put a number on it. Let's say the total value they create in that day is $100. Simple enough. Now, the owner of the factory, the capitalist, has to pay that worker. But, and this is the absolute key to the whole theory, they don't pay the worker for the full value they created. Instead, they pay them a wage, let's say $20 for the day. That wage isn't based on the value the worker produced. It's based on what it costs to keep that worker alive and able to come back to work tomorrow. And that $80 difference? That is what Marx called surplus value. It's the value the worker created but wasn't paid for. This surplus, he argued, is the hidden source of all profit in a capitalist system. It is, fundamentally, unpaid labor. So, if you see the entire system as being built on this process of extracting surplus value, this exploitation, it's going to lead you to some pretty radical political conclusions. Marx believed the system wasn't just unfair, but that its constant need to maximize profit would eventually lead to its own collapse, making a revolution basically inevitable. And what's really interesting is that the Communist Manifesto wasn't just abstract philosophy. It laid out a list of very practical demands. These were concrete policies designed to strip the economic power away from the ownership class. Things like getting rid of private land ownership, creating a seriously progressive income tax, and ending the right to inherit massive fortunes. But you have to remember, for Marx, the revolution and all these policies were just a phase. They were a transition. The ultimate end goal, the final synthesis to resolve capitalism's conflict, was a true communist society. One with no state, no social classes, where all production is owned in common. And the guiding principle is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Which, of course, brings us all the way back to where we started. After tracing this whole intellectual journey, from the dialectic to surplus value to revolution, we're left with that fundamental challenge to how we see our world. Is the story of human society a story about the evolution of ideas and morals? Or is it, at its core, a story about the endless battle over who gets the stuff? That question is just as powerful and just as controversial today as it was